Welcome to the fourth week of our fall message series we're calling 8th Grade Faith. For most of us who grew up Catholic, we went to Catholic school. And if we're entirely honest, the driving, motivating force for many parents then, as it is now, is getting their kids through it all. First communion, confirmation, and then after that, they're done. After that, parents feel like they can relax because they've done their job. Meanwhile, your religious education experience was pretty much bad and boring. Besides, you were told that once you were confirmed, you were an adult in the Catholic Church. And when you looked around at the other adults in the church, you weren't too inspired to join that club. It just looked like a lot of people essentially punching in their time cards. So when you had the chance to head for the exit, you took it, and you never looked back. Confirmation effectively became graduation from church, from religion, from religious education, from faith formation, and from all of it. Now, we're not saying that this makes you a bad person. It's not as if you've given up on God, because you definitely didn't. But you definitely gave up on a lot of things that usually goes along with God. What you're left holding as an adult is, well, frankly, an 8th grade faith. Now, an 8th grade faith isn't a bad thing if you're actually in grade 8. But an 8th grade faith is a distinct disadvantage for the rest of us who are no longer in grade 8. And it can actually, in some ways, handicap us for the challenges that come with adult living. Think about it. You're not the same person anymore. You've hopefully matured in every other aspect of your life. Can you imagine living any area of your adult life based on your 8th grade understanding of those areas? Well, the same thing is true when it comes to faith. And that's what this series is all about. This series, we're digging deep into the pervasive reality of our modern-day Catholic culture. No judgments and no guilt tripping. This series is only about moving on to a more useful approach when it comes to our faith. So a few weeks ago, we looked at moving to a more mature understanding of God's law, which we live out of love and not out of fear. We looked at living in the light of eternity. You see, as kids, we can't see beyond the next thing or even the next weekend. But the Lord invites us to look at our lives with a long view, which is God's view. Last week, we looked at seeing faith not as an obligation, but as a lifestyle choice. And we encouraged you to give small groups a try. We actually had a good number of people sign up too, which is great. I was really impressed by that. But if you didn't get a chance to sign up last week or you weren't around, you still have an opportunity to do that. Just stop by the welcome desk in the narthex after Mass today. Small groups are an opportunity to find support and encouragement and accountability in your Christian living, and they are a must-try, in my opinion. Now, I've already shared with you that when it comes to 8th grade faith, I'm definitely not casting any judgment against anybody because I'm that guy. This series springs from my own experience. I stopped going to church for a while in high school and in university, and I got stuck in that place for a while. But interestingly, I never stopped praying, at least not entirely. I prayed. I prayed when I wanted something. I prayed when I needed something. And most urgently, I prayed when I was afraid or in trouble. And at one point in high school, I wasn't taking school and studies very seriously, not very seriously at all. I just wanted to have fun and engage in extracurricular activities. Well, when exam time came around, I took a gamble. Sometimes I would study. Sometimes I would just cram as much information as I could. And sometimes I wouldn't. And I remember sitting behind that desk at exam time thinking, oh boy, I'm doomed. You know when you flip the sheet over and the first question already stumps you? And so I found myself praying. I powered through Hail Marys. I don't know if I should admit this or not, but sometimes in certain situations, I just power through Hail Marys. Sort of a desperate move. But I'd be powering through them so quickly. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for sinners now, at the hour of our death. Amen. repeat, and repeat again. I would just power through those Hail Marys. I don't know what I think I was accomplishing, but if anything, it at least calmed me down some. Anyway, today we're going to be looking at prayer. Growing up, most of us were taught prayers, but we weren't necessarily taught how to pray. If your experience is anything like mine, you were taught to say your prayers before you went to bed, before meals. You memorized prayers, you repeated them over and over and over again. You could literally even say them in your sleep. And don't get me wrong, as expressions of worship and acknowledgement of the power and presence of God, they're a worthwhile exercise. But those prayers, if you think about it, are essentially monologues offered for something. For food, for sleep, wish fulfillment, protection, or anxiety management. Most of all, it was just a way to cover your bases. Saying prayer is one thing, but entering into prayer is an entirely different thing. And today we're going to look at that. We're looking at entering into prayer as a way of moving on from our 8th grade faith. Now, to do that, we're going to look at today's first reading from a fellow named Habakkuk. The book of Habakkuk is a short little book of the Bible, just 3 chapters. In fact, you can read the entire thing in about 15 minutes. Actually, I'm going to make that my challenge for you this week. Go home and read the book of Habakkuk. Now, Habakkuk lived about 650 years before Christ. He lived in the city of Jerusalem under the rule of a cruel and corrupt king. And as a result, corruption was rampant throughout Jerusalem. Jerusalem was supposed to be this shining city on a hill, an inspiration to the rest of the world of God's goodness and grace. But at this point, it was very far from that. It was filled with violence and corruption and injustice. And this really bothered Habakkuk. It bothered him so much that he prayed to God about it. And here's Habakkuk's prayer. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not listen? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? You ever felt like that? Well, Habakkuk certainly did. He'd been asking God for help, asking God to do something about the problems that were all around him, but he felt like God wasn't listening, like God didn't care. Habakkuk felt ignored, and he made sure to let God know about it. Now, you might think that this is disrespectful. You might think that such reactions have no place in prayer. You might be afraid to talk to God like that. But Habakkuk wasn't. In fact, he teaches us that God is big enough to handle our anger. God invites us to move beyond saying prayers, to enter into prayer as a conversation with Him. And one of the best ways to enter into a conversation with God is to be honest about your feelings. Prayer doesn't require piety, but it does require honesty. In any relationship, honesty is a basic ingredient. If you're angry towards your spouse, or frustrated with your friends, or annoyed with one of your kids, suppressing it isn't going to help. At best, nothing will get better, and at worst, it will actually damage the relationship. In order for that relationship to grow, you've got to share what's really going on. Maybe you've stopped going to church, or you've stopped praying because you thought God should have done something that He didn't do. He didn't prevent the accident. He didn't remove the problem. He didn't save the marriage. And you're angry. You're angry at God because if He is God, then He should have done something. Well, if that's your situation, the very best thing for you to do is to talk to Him. That's what Habakkuk did at great length, actually. And he goes on with his complaint. Why do you make me see wrongdoing and look at trouble? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. He's basically saying, why me? Why do I have to put up with everything that is going on around me? Why do the bad guys always win and the good guys lose? Nowhere does our Christian faith argue that there must be a God because everything is perfect. And some people lose their faith exactly because of this point. Now, Habakkuk does not buy the lie. He didn't use the injustice in the world around him to come to the conclusion that there is no God or that God doesn't care. He uses it as an opportunity to turn to God in prayer. He allowed his frustration and his anger to drive him deeper into prayer. Now think about it. If we used the opportunity for our frustration and our anger to drive us deeper into prayer, we would be world-class prayers. So Habakkuk complains and complains and complains to God, and eventually God responds. He gives him the answer that he was asking for, but it's not the answer that he wanted. He essentially says, don't worry about these corrupt politicians in Jerusalem, because I'm sending the Babylonians to take over. Now, time out. Here's all you need to know about the Babylonians. They were bad news. The contemporary equivalent of this would be that you're praying and expressing your frustration about the politicians in Toronto. Of course, that's a hypothetical thing, and I know nobody has frustrations with the politicians in Toronto. But let's just say that you're praying about that, and then God answers your prayer and he says, oh, don't worry about that, because the North Koreans are coming, and they'll take over the government. Not exactly comforting news, but that's basically the news that Habakkuk receives. Now, Habakkuk is left speechless. If God is all-powerful, and if God is all-knowing, then we could and should expect that his ways are not always our ways. But when that happens, what do? Well, here's what Habakkuk did. I will stand at my watchpost and station myself on the ramparts. I will keep watch to see what he will say to me and what he will answer concerning my complaint. So, conversation is listening as well as talking. And to do that, we've got to position ourselves to be able to hear, because most of our lives is so filled with noise that we can barely hear anything. Habakkuk wants to place himself in exactly the right position to hear what God has to say to him, if in fact he has anything at all to say. Habakkuk just stands ready to listen. If you don't have a daily prayer time, you owe it to yourself to carve one out and then guard it. To have a time and a place where you can pray, even if it's just for 5 or 6 minutes a day. That is a great place to start. And as a part of your daily prayer time, you need some quiet time. Quiet time which you don't say anything at all. Or you could try Eucharistic adoration. I don't know if you know about that, but it's a tradition of prayer before the exposed Blessed Sacrament as a form of worship. Now, we offer Eucharistic adoration every single day in a little room right off the main parking lot. And nothing is said. You're just there in silence. And it's actually very powerful. A daily prayer time with a daily quiet time. That's what Habakkuk did. Now, he waits on the Lord in silence, and his perseverance pays off big time because God responds. There is a vision for the appointed time. It speaks of the end and does not lie. If it seems to tarry, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. God says to Habakkuk that his vision will be accomplished in his time, in his way. Period. It's not for Habakkuk to know or to see or to understand what's happening. It's for Habakkuk to know and to see and to understand that no matter what is happening, God is at work and God will triumph. The person who enters into prayer understands this. They wait patiently, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes they're able to see God in action. They get where God is going and what God is doing. Prayer, like Habakkuk's, does not limit God to our circumstances or to our understanding, but it trusts that in all of our circumstances and way beyond our understanding, that God is present. God is present even when he seems absent. God is moving even when we don't know where he's going. In today's gospel reading, the apostles approach Jesus with a kind of childlike request. They simply ask him to increase their faith as if it were magic. And he answers their request by discussing the role of a servant. Now, what's that all about? Well, more than anything else, a good servant is attentive to the master. And that's what prayer is. Being attentive to God in all things, rather than trying to get God to do what you want him to do. Aim to see where God is moving, rather than resisting his direction. Join him. Go where God is blessing. Habakkuk didn't hear what he wanted to hear, that's for sure. But he eventually embraced what he heard. Don't expect to hear from God what you desire. Instead, in prayer, learn to desire what you will hear.